A wealthy woman named Vivian Caldwell invited her lover back to her mansion the very day after her husband's funeral. The following morning, as she sat in her late husband's lawyer's office, Vivian was blindsided by the shocking terms of his will. The security guards escorted Vivian, nearly 70 years old, out of her mansion, her high-end heels dragging over the stone steps. Never in her wildest dreams did Vivian think she would be tossed from the home she had inhabited for 4 decades. "This is wrong. I am Vivian Caldwell," she screamed, her voice shaking as mascara smudged down her lined face. Just 1 day earlier, she had stood on that very spot, accepting the sympathies of others at her husband Charles's funeral. That day had been somber and cloudy, ideal for such an occasion during a cool Palm Springs winter. Vivian had dressed to impress, wearing her most elegant black dress with a diamond necklace that sparkled as she greeted prominent figures from the city. Her manicured fingers dabbed a handkerchief embroidered with her initials at her eyes, though, for those paying close attention, no tears actually fell during the service. While the priest spoke of Charles's generosity and wisdom, Vivian's gaze often drifted to Gregory Walters, her 45-year-old golf instructor, who lingered in the back of the crowd. The stolen glances between Vivian and Gregory did not escape the notice of Frank Mitchell, an elderly janitor who had been loyal to Charles for 3 decades. Holding a thick envelope in his rough hands, Frank watched Vivian with a grim expression. As Vivian addressed the guests, she spoke with a practiced quiver in her voice. Charles was the backbone of this community, building not only buildings but dreams. Yet even as she spoke, she allowed herself a slight smile, thinking about the new dreams she would create with Gregory. Those attending whispered among themselves when Vivian abruptly left after the service, hardly waiting to shake the last hands that reached out in condolence. Some murmured that she was overcome by grief, while others criticized her haste. That evening, Vivian opened the grand doors of her mansion to Gregory, her hands trembling with excitement as she poured them each a glass of Charles's prized whiskey. Finally, she whispered, raising her glass toward Gregory's, "We can be together without hiding." Gregory drew her close, his cologne mingling with the scent of whiskey. "You were fantastic today, darling. So convincing." They spent the night reveling in their newfound freedom, drinking Charles's finest wines and swaying to classic records. Vivian felt as if she were young again, laughing and twirling around the marble floor with Gregory. "Tomorrow," she told him, "we'll go to the lawyer's office, and everything will be ours." But Vivian was oblivious to Frank, who had been quietly watching through the window, camera in hand, documenting her betrayal of the man who had once given him a chance. Now, only a day later, Vivian was being removed from her own property. Her expensive dress was crumpled, her carefully arranged hair in disarray. Gregory was nowhere in sight. One of the guards spoke gently, "Mrs. Caldwell, we have strict instructions. You cannot be here until after the will reading tomorrow." Shocked, Vivian demanded, "Who gave you these orders?" "Charles is gone, I own everything now." From the mansion's shadowed entrance, Frank stepped forward, still holding that mysterious envelope. "No, Mrs. Caldwell," he said softly. "Not yet." Charles made sure of that. With the gates shutting behind her, Vivian stood outside, clutching her purse tightly, feeling true fear for the first time since Charles's death. She caught a glimpse of Frank disappearing back into the mansion with the envelope still in his grip. What Vivian did not realize was that this envelope contained only the beginning of many surprises Charles had arranged for her. The true shock would hit her at the reading of the will, where she would see just how well her late husband had known her. As night descended over Palm Springs, Vivian Caldwell, once a queen of the city's social elite, had nowhere left to turn except for the guest room of her only remaining friend, Linda. Tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, though not in the way she anticipated. The next morning, Vivian pulled into her usual reserved spot at the law office in her Mercedes, her face set with determination. However, a security guard approached her car and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, you will need to park in the visitors section." Clenching the steering wheel, she responded, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, "which is why I have to ask you to move." Mr. Thompson's orders. Inside, Vivian jabbed the elevator button repeatedly, her phone displaying 15 missed calls to Gregory, all unanswered. She had spent the night tossing in her friend Linda's guest room, her mind racing with questions about the envelope Frank had held. The law office was packed with board members, executives, and even cleaning staff. Frank sat in the front row, still clutching that envelope. "Where's Gregory?" Vivian whispered to Linda. "No one's seen him since last night," her friend replied. Mr. Thompson, Charles's lawyer of 3 decades, cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, Mrs. Caldwell, please check your bank accounts." With shaking hands, Vivian opened her banking app. Her accounts were frozen. How is this even possible? Charles has only been gone for 2 days. Actually, Mr. Thompson replied, Mr. Caldwell arranged this 3 months ago. He then inserted a disc into a player, and Charles's face appeared on the screen, looking weary but resolute. "Dear Vivian," he began, "if you are watching this, you may be wondering about Gregory Walters. Do not worry, he is likely en route to Florida by now, where he has run the same scheme with several other wealthy widows." Vivian's complexion turned ghostly white as murmurs rippled through the room. "I've known about your affair for months," Charles's image continued. "But rather than confront you, I decided to offer you something more valuable than money, a chance for redemption." Mr. Thompson handed Vivian a document. 90% of the estate would be used to establish the Caldwell Foundation, aimed at helping working-class individuals start their own businesses. "This is absurd," Vivian shouted, her voice trembling. "I will challenge this." "You can," Mr. Thompson replied calmly, "but then these will become public." Frank stepped forward and opened the envelope, revealing photographs of Vivian and Gregory, dated and time-stamped over a span of 2 years. Vivian turned on Frank, hissing, "You spied on me?" "No, Mrs. Caldwell," he replied flatly. "I protected my friend," Charles's voice continued from the screen. "Vivian, you have a choice: walk away with nothing or earn your inheritance by working at the foundation for 1 year, not as a boss, but as an employee." The room spun around Vivian, she gripped the table to steady herself. "And one more thing," Charles added, his face turning serious. "Frank Mitchell will be the foundation's director." Vivian's knees buckled as she collapsed into her chair. Frank approached with another envelope. "Mr. Caldwell asked me to give you this after the reading," he said quietly. Inside was a photo that made Vivian's heart skip, Charles as a young man standing beside a woman she hadn't seen in decades, her mother. "What is this?" she whispered. "The beginning of the truth," Frank replied. "There's so much you don't know about your own life, Mrs. Caldwell, so much that Charles protected you from." As Vivian stared at the old photograph, her phone buzzed with a news alert: Gregory Walters, a local golf instructor, arrested in Florida, suspected of multiple widow fraud cases. The conference room gradually emptied, leaving Vivian alone with the photo of her mother and a life-changing decision. Through the window, she could see her Mercedes being towed away, the first of many privileges she was about to lose. Frank stood by the door. "The foundation office opens at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Your desk is in the back, next to the copy machine," he said, pausing. "And by the way, we have a strict dress code, no designer labels." Vivian looked at her mother's face in the photograph, seeing something she had never noticed before, the same determination she had always admired in Charles's eyes. Tomorrow would be her first day of work, real work. At nearly 70, Vivian Caldwell would finally learn what it meant to earn something. Vivian stared at her reflection in the department store mirror. The plain black slacks and white button-up shirt felt like a disguise. No designer labels, no jewelry, she had never felt more invisible. "The bus to the foundation leaves in 10 minutes, a store clerk announced over the intercom. Bus. The word made Vivian's stomach churn. At the bus stop, she checked her phone again, all her credit cards had been declined, and her safe deposit box was empty. Gregory had been thorough. First time on public transportation. An elderly woman smiled at her. Vivian nodded stiffly, clutching her new clearance rack purse. The foundation office was in one of Charles's oldest buildings downtown. For the first time, Vivian entered through the employee entrance, her ID badge marking her as Staff Level 1. Mrs. Caldwell, Frank called from his office, Charles's former office. We need to talk about your mother. Vivian froze. What about her? Frank pulled out an old newspaper clipping. Your mother, Grace, wasn't just any housekeeper, she was the Caldwell family's most trusted employee. That's impossible, my mother was a teacher, Vivian replied in disbelief. Is that what they told you? Frank pushed the clipping toward her. The headline read, Caldwell heir marries housekeeper's daughter. I don't understand, Vivian whispered. Your family was bankrupt, Vivian. Your father's gambling debts nearly ruined you. Charles's parents arranged the marriage to spare your mother from scandal. A woman entered carrying cleaning supplies, Maria Sanchez, according to her badge. She paused when she saw Vivian. Mrs. Caldwell, Maria said softly. I knew your mother. Vivian's head snapped up. How? She trained me when I first started here, Maria said. She always told me her daughter would never know what it meant to clean other people's homes. Maria's eyes were kind but firm. She was so proud when you married Mr. Caldwell. Vivian sank into a chair. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because, Frank replied, Charles promised your mother he'd give you the life she never had. But now, it's time for you to learn where you came from. He handed her a small key. This was in Charles's personal safe. It opens your mother's old house. My house now. Everything is still there, just as she left it. Vivian's hands trembled. You live in my mother's house. Charles gave it to me after she passed, Frank said. He thought it should go to someone who understood its true worth. The morning blurred by as Vivian filed papers, made copies, and watched Maria and her team work with quiet efficiency, each task a reminder of the life her mother had led. At lunch, she found herself in the break room with Maria. Your mother used to eat lunch right here, Maria said. She'd save half her sandwich every day, saying she was watching her figure. But really, she was giving it to the homeless man outside. Vivian remembered her mother's small portions, assuming it was vanity. How much else had she misunderstood? After work, Vivian took the bus to her mother's old neighborhood. The house was modest but impeccably kept. Frank had preserved it just as it was. Inside, she found her mother's diary in a bedroom drawer. The first entry made her sink to the floor. Today, my Vivian married into the family I have served for 20 years. Charles promised to love her and never let her feel the shame of being a servant's daughter. But I am not ashamed. One day, she'll understand that dignity isn't in what you own but in what you give. Vivian read through her tears until a knock at the door startled her. It was Gregory. Hello, darling, he smiled. Miss me? Get out, she whispered. Now. Is that any way to talk to the man who still has all your secrets? He sneered, holding up his phone. Including some rather interesting photos. Vivian clutched her mother's diary to her chest. Do what you want. I need the truth more than I need my reputation. Gregory's smile faltered. You've changed. No, Vivian said calmly. I'm finally becoming who I always was, my mother's daughter. As Gregory left, Vivian saw Maria watching from across the street. Their eyes met, and Maria nodded in quiet approval. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, but for the first time, Vivian was ready to face them. She opened her mother's diary again, letting Grace's words guide her into a past she had never known. Vivian arrived at work early the next morning, her mother's diary in her bag. The security guard, John Taylor, nodded as she passed. Mrs. Caldwell, he called out. Mr. Mitchell wants to see you in the conference room. The room was filled with employees she had barely noticed before. Maria sat near the front, and beside her was John, now wearing a business suit instead of his security uniform. "Everyone," Frank announced, "John will be presenting his veteran employment program today." As John stood up, Vivian noticed something familiar in his expression, a look of determination she had seen so often in Charles's old photos. "I developed this software to match veterans' military skills with civilian jobs," John Taylor said, his tone steady as he addressed the room. Vivian watched him closely, noting his gestures and the way he moved his hands. It was so much like Charles. Frank passed around folders, and inside, Vivian found another photograph, Charles in a military uniform, standing beside a young woman dressed as a nurse. "That's my mother," John said quietly, looking directly at Vivian. "Charles Caldwell was my father." The room fell silent. "Is that possible?" Vivian whispered. "It was before he met you," Frank explained. "Vietnam, 1971. Charles didn't know about John until 3 months ago." Vivian's hands shook. "Is this why he hired him?" "No," Frank replied. "Charles hired John as a security guard 5 years ago, without knowing who he was. The DNA test results came after Charles fell ill." Maria gently touched Vivian's arm. "There's more." John sat down across from Vivian. "I hadn't planned to tell anyone, but when Charles found out, he changed his will. He wanted to make things right." Vivian opened her mother's diary, and suddenly, the timeline clicked. Her marriage to Charles had been arranged just months after his return from Vietnam. "Did my mother know?" "Everyone knew, except you," Frank replied. "Your mother suggested the marriage to protect both families from scandal. Charles agreed, but only if John and his mother would be taken care of privately." Vivian recalled Charles's frequent business trips to Chicago, where John's mother had lived. "Why tell me now?" "Because," John said, "the Foundation's first project will be my veteran employment program, and I need your help." Vivian looked confused. "My help? I don't know anything about business." John smiled. "But you know everyone who does. Your social connections could open doors for thousands of veterans." The irony wasn't lost on Vivian. Her network, built through years of charity events and social climbing, might finally have a real purpose. "There's something else you should see," Frank said, starting a video on the conference room screen. Charles appeared, looking weary but content. "Vivian, if you're watching this, it means you've met your stepson. John is everything we could have wanted in a son, hardworking, compassionate, dedicated to service. I'm sorry I kept this from you, but I had to protect everyone involved. Now, it's time for you to help him succeed where I couldn't." The video ended, and Vivian looked at John, now recognizing Charles's features in him. "I want to help," she said, "but first, I need to understand everything. No more secrets." Frank nodded and handed her a stack of letters, correspondence between Charles and John's mother that spanned decades. As Vivian began to read, Maria started gathering her cleaning supplies. "Stay," Vivian said. "I think I need friends more than I need privacy right now." John smiled, a reflection of Charles's own smile. "Then let's talk about how we can help other veterans find their way home." Outside the conference room, Vivian's old social circle was gathering for a charity luncheon in the building's restaurant. She could hear their laughter and their superficial chatter. For the first time, she didn't miss it. She had work to do, real work, and a family she never knew she had. The next steps would challenge her in ways she had never imagined as Gregory's threats and her past privileges clashed with her new reality. "Look who made the Palm Springs Times," Maria said, dropping a newspaper on Vivian's desk. The headline read, "Caldwell Widow, From Riches to Rags." Vivian scanned the article, her heart sinking. Gregory had given an interview, painting himself as the victim of her seduction. "Do not let him get to you," Maria said. "We have work to do." The Foundation's first veteran employment fair was scheduled for the following week. Vivian spent her morning calling her old contacts, but most calls went straight to voicemail. Mrs. Anderson's office, a familiar voice answered. "Susan, it's Vivian Caldwell." "Oh, Mrs. Caldwell," came the hesitant response, "Mrs. Anderson isn't taking calls from disgraced widows." "Fine," Vivian said curtly, "but tell her she'll miss out on helping 500 veterans find jobs." After lunch, Frank called Vivian into his office. "Charles left something else for you," he said, handing her a USB drive. He recorded this the day he discovered Gregory's true identity. On the screen, Charles sat in his home office. "Vivian, by now you've probably realized I knew about Gregory. What you don't know is how I found out." The video showed footage of Gregory meeting with wealthy widows in Florida, Arizona, and California. "He has been running this scam for years," Charles continued. "Instead of exposing him right away, I saw an opportunity. You needed to learn something more valuable than money, the worth of real work and genuine relationships." Vivian watched as Charles detailed his plans for the foundation, John's program, and even Maria's role. "Maria's husband was my friend in Vietnam," Charles explained in the video. "She's been waiting for the right moment to help you understand what true friendship means." A knock interrupted the video. John entered with a grim expression. "Gregory's back in town. He's talking to reporters about your past, trying to smear you." Vivian's heart raced. "What past?" "He's claiming he has proof you married Charles for his money and knew about me the whole time. He's saying you kept me hidden from my father." Frank switched off the video. "Vivian, there's something else you need to know about Gregory. He didn't just target you, he tried to seduce your daughter, Lily, last year." Vivian clutched the edge of her chair. "Charles discovered this?" "Yes," John replied. "It was what finally pushed him to act. Lily rejected Gregory, but he threatened to expose her struggles with addiction." "My daughter never had addiction problems," Vivian protested. "No," Maria said gently. "Because Charles quietly paid for her treatment before anyone found out. He protected your entire family, Vivian." Memories flooded back as Vivian recalled Lily's sudden trip to Europe last year. All the pieces began to fit. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Charles wanted to," John said. "But he knew you weren't ready to hear it. He wanted you to learn empathy first." Vivian opened her mother's diary again, and the final entry caught her eye. Charles promised to teach Vivian the value of hard work, even if it took years. Love sometimes means letting people find their own way to the truth. Maria placed a hand on Vivian's shoulder. "Your old friends are organizing a charity gala next week," she said. "It's on the same night as our veteran job fair. They're trying to outshine us. And Gregory is involved," John added. Vivian stood, determination hardening her expression. "Then let's show them what real charity looks like." She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Channel 7 News. "This is Vivian Caldwell. I'm ready to tell my story, the real story." As she hung up, Frank smiled. "Charles would be proud." "No," Vivian replied. "My mother would be proud, and that matters more." Outside, Gregory stood, watching the foundation building with a smug look, his phone filled with secrets he thought could ruin Vivian. What he didn't know was that she had finally found something stronger than fear, purpose. Tomorrow, she would face her old world with new eyes. The Veteran Job Fair would show Palm Springs what the Caldwell Foundation truly stood for. But first, she had a daughter to call and a long-overdue conversation about forgiveness to begin. Vivian sat in her tiny apartment, watching her interview on Channel 7. Her story had gone viral overnight, a wealthy widow choosing to work with veterans over returning to her privileged life. Her phone rang. "Mom." Lily's voice cracked. "I saw the interview. I know about last year, about Gregory." Silence filled the line. "Dad knew," Lily continued. He protected us both. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm coming home, Mom. I want to help with the veteran program. A knock at the door interrupted their call. Gregory stood there, a charming smile on his face. Hello, Vivian. May I come in? No. Are you sure? He asked, holding up a check. $5 million. Your old friends miss you. Vivian noticed a familiar car parked across the street, her cousin Edward's Bentley. Who's really behind this offer? Gregory smirked. Smart girl. Edward and a few others think the foundation is bad for Palm Springs' image. They want to buy you out. The foundation isn't for sale. Maybe these will change your mind. Gregory opened his phone, showing photos of Lily at rehab. Imagine these going public. Vivian's hands trembled. Come in. Let's talk. Inside, Gregory laid out the deal. Edward will marry you. You'll get your lifestyle back. All you have to do is sign over the foundation. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow, everyone finds out how the esteemed Charles Caldwell's daughter struggled with pills, how his wife knew about his illegitimate son but kept it quiet for the money. A noise from the kitchen made Gregory jump. Maria stepped out, her phone raised, recording. Got it all, she said, her voice steady. The blackmail, the bribery attempt, everything. Gregory lunged toward her, but before he could reach her, the door burst open, and John Taylor entered with 2 police officers. Gregory Walters, one officer said, you're under arrest for attempted extortion. As they led Gregory away, Edward appeared in the doorway, watching with a cold, calculating look. It's not too late, he said to Vivian. Think about your reputation. Vivian straightened herself and replied, that's why I'm choosing the foundation. After they left, Maria hugged Vivian. You okay? No, she admitted, but I need to get to the hospital. At Palm Springs General, they found Frank in the emergency room, looking worn out. My wife, Janet, had a fall at the nursing home. The insurance will not cover her treatment, he said, visibly defeated. Vivian reached into her pocket, where she still had the check Gregory had tried to bribe her with. Yes, it will. Frank shook his head. No, that is your money. It's blood money. Let me do this, Vivian insisted. As the doctors wheeled Janet to her room, Vivian saw a familiar determination in Frank's eyes, much like her mother's, in the old photos she had rediscovered. There's something else you should know, Maria said gently. Janet's fall wasn't an accident. She tried to, she hesitated. She's been struggling ever since I fired her, hasn't she? Vivian asked, a wave of guilt washing over her. I let her go over something as trivial as a broken vase. Frank nodded. She never quite recovered from the shame. Vivian sank into a waiting room chair, the weight of her actions pressing on her. I did this. I caused this. No, Frank replied. We all did, by allowing a world where some people are seen as worth more than others. Vivian's phone buzzed, and a message flashed on the screen. Lily had just landed at Palm Springs Airport. Another notification showed the local news announcing Gregory's arrest. Moments later, Lily appeared in the hallway. Is this where I start making amends? She asked softly. Vivian pulled her daughter into an embrace. This is where we all do. Outside, Edward sat in his car, watching as Vivian, Lily, Maria, and Frank exited the hospital together. His phone buzzed. She didn't take the bribe, he reported. Should we move to Plan B? Later that night, in her modest apartment, Vivian read more of her mother's diary. True wealth isn't in what we own but in the lives we change along the way. She closed the diary, feeling more grounded than ever. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges. The veteran job fair was in 2 days, and it would be going head-to-head with Edward's charity gala. But for the first time, Vivian knew exactly where she belonged. Lily sat beside her, flipping through old family photos. Dad would be proud of you, Mom. Vivian smiled softly. No, he'd be proud of us. The morning of the veteran job fair, Vivian arrived at the foundation only to find the building's power cut off. Edward's doing, Frank muttered, inspecting the electrical panel. He owns the maintenance company. Lily was already on the phone, making calls. Half our corporate partners cancelled, she said, her tone tight with frustration. They're all going to Edward's gala instead. We have 2 hours before 500 veterans arrive. John Taylor glanced at his watch. Any ideas? Vivian looked down at her mother's diary on the desk, then reached for the phone. Susan. It's Vivian Caldwell again. Remember when you covered up your son's DUI last year? Charles helped with that. I need your generator company now. Within the hour, generators were humming outside, and Maria's cleaning team had transformed the space into a professional venue. Mom! Lily called out, her voice filled with urgency. Gregory's at the local news station, he's going live in 10 minutes. They huddled around a laptop to watch the broadcast. Gregory sat across from Martha Chen, Palm Springs' top reporter. So, Gregory, Martha began, you claim that Vivian Caldwell knew about her husband's illegitimate son? Gregory shifted in his seat. Actually, Martha, I'd like to correct that. He paused, glancing at the camera. The truth is, I lied about Vivian. I was hired by Edward Bennett to discredit her and the foundation. Martha's eyes widened. Do you have proof? Gregory held up his phone. I do, complete text messages, recordings, everything. Edward wanted to buy the foundation's building for his new development project. Back at the foundation, the phones began to ring. Corporate partners who had cancelled were now asking to come back on board. What just happened? Lily asked, bewildered. Frank chuckled. I paid Gregory a visit in jail last night. I showed him proof that Edward planned to betray him. He chose the smart option. Veterans began to arrive, including familiar faces from Vivian's former social circle, the sons, daughters, and grandchildren of Palm Springs elite. A young man in uniform approached. Mrs. Caldwell. I'm Robert Anderson, Susan Anderson's grandson, just returned from Afghanistan. Vivian remembered him as a child at her pool parties. Now, he was seeking a fresh start. John's software paired veterans with employers, Maria's team served coffee, and Lily helped with resumes. Vivian watched, feeling a peaceful fulfillment she had never known before. Then she saw Janet, Frank's wife, walking slowly through the doors. Janet? Vivian whispered. Should you be out of the hospital? I needed to see this, Janet replied softly. To understand what Charles's dream really meant. They stood together, watching as Frank assisted a veteran in a wheelchair. I never apologized, Vivian said, for firing you, for everything. Janet touched her arm. And I never thanked you. For what? For showing me that anyone can change. Thank you for listening to the first part. We'll continue in the next video.